How to debate a Stratfordian. Shakespeare scholarship today is dominated by Stratfordianism, or the theory that Will of Stratford-upon-Avon was the author of Shakespeare's plays. But Oxfordians, who claim authorship for Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, are gaining steam. In this video, I'll be rebutting some of the most frequently cited Stratfordian arguments against Edward de Vere having written Shakespeare's plays. Argument 1. Some of Shakespeare's plays were written after de Vere was already dead. This will often be the first argument Stratfordians will pull out, and it's actually entirely false. Their talking point will be that Edward de Vere died in 1604, and The Tempest came out sometime after 1604, so case closed. But is it? According to Stratfordians, the source for The Tempest was a personal letter that William Strachey wrote in 1609 about a shipwreck in Bermuda. However, evidence for this is so flimsy that even Stratfordian scholars have started to disavow it in recent years. And Stratfordian scholar David Lindley wrote that there is, quote, virtually nothing in common between the play and Strachey's letter. Furthermore, this letter wasn't actually published until 1625, nearly a decade after Will of Stratford died. For him to use this as a source, he would have had to somehow see the original private letter before it was published, which is highly unlikely. Also, if you've seen or read The Tempest, you'll note that the shipwreck isn't really a central focus of the play, so it's always been strange to suggest that it was inspired by this shipwreck letter. Oxfordian scholars have found much stronger links to scenarios in Italian Commedia dell'arte, or a 1555 translation of Peter Martyr's Decades as a source text for this play. But that's not all. Not only is the argument dating it to after 1604 flawed, but in fact there is strong evidence to suggest that an early version of The Tempest was performed for Queen Elizabeth at court before 1583. Philip Sidney's Apology for Poesy mocks a plot involving a shipwreck and a monster from a rocky cave who makes a fire. And several eyewitnesses, including writer Anthony Munday and French ambassador Mauvissiere, recounted a 1579 courtly revel in which a giant prop ship was crashed on stage, from which Edward de Vere emerged to theatrically present Queen Elizabeth with a splendid jewel. Here's an interesting fact. Stratfordian linguist Jonathan Hope developed a method to assess the birth years of various writers based on the changing usages of English. To his surprise, his objective analysis found that though Christopher Marlowe and Will of Stratford were born the same year, Shakespeare's plays seem to have been written by a man about a decade older than Marlowe, closer to the age of Edward de Vere. Even E.K. Chambers, the Stratfordian scholar whose dating of the plays are upheld by most mainstream academics, admitted himself that he was working backwards from the Stratford man's lifespan. I remember being taught in school that Shakespeare, despite being the greatest literary genius of all time, was constantly plagiarizing work by other Elizabethan writers. Actually, the reverse is true, and early versions of Shakespeare's plays were being performed nearly 20 years earlier than traditional dating, inspiring copycats and ripoffs into the 1600s. Argument 2. Shakespeare's plays demonstrate a detailed knowledge of glove-making, thus proving that he had to be the son of a glove-maker. Glove-making was indeed one of the many careers of Will of Stratford's father, at least for a time. But is it really true that Shakespeare's references to glove-making could have only been written by a glove-maker's son? Or is this yet another case of working backwards from a Stratfordian assumption? In fact, Shakespeare's supposedly encyclopedic knowledge of glove-making is founded primarily on just 2 lines. In The Merry Wives of Windsor, a character says, quote, "Does he not wear a great round beard, like a glover's paring knife?" And in Romeo and Juliet, Mercutio says, "Oh, here's a wit of cheverel that stretches from an inch narrow to an ell broad." Cheverel is a type of leather that can be used to make gloves and other things too. It's my opinion that an intellectually honest person would not find these instances to be conclusive evidence that Shakespeare had to have been a glover's son. Edward de Vere was actually a major clothes horse who gave a gift of special perfumed gloves to Queen Elizabeth that became a major fashion trend at the Elizabethan court, so he had an equal claim to Will of Stratford as a gloves enthusiast. Argument 3. Shakespeare had to be a rural commoner because he knows so much about botany. The truth is that though farming and edible crops would have been the domain of rural commoners, botany and plant classification was more of an aristocratic hobby. The estates on which Edward de Vere grew up had some of the most massive pleasure gardens in England, cultivated by the country's leading collector and cataloger of exotic plants. It's very likely that Edward de Vere learned the many botanical references peppered through the Shakespeare plays while roaming his childhood estates. Taking down Stratfordians. Argument 4. Shakespeare favors the dialect spoken in Warwickshire, corresponding to his upbringing in Stratford-upon-Avon. This is simply false. A scholar in 1900 was surprised by, quote, not finding a single Warwickshire word among the 6,000 in Venus and Adonis. Many researchers have investigated this claim, but as A.G. Poynton summarized it, of all the regions of Britain, Warwickshire has the least influence on Shakespeare's language. Argument 5. We can prove Shakespeare wasn't educated like a nobleman because Ben Jonson tells us that Shakespeare doesn't know much Latin or Greek. Okay, let's untangle this claim because it's actually pretty convoluted. Ben Jonson's famous poem dedicated to Shakespeare contains the line, "And though thou hadst small Latin and less Greek." This is a weird line from Jonson because if you read the Shakespeare plays, he's clearly extremely proficient in ancient languages and fluent in Latin. For example, this scene from Act 5 of Love's Labour's Lost contains an escalating sequence of puns in Latin. This is just one example of so many in Shakespeare that it's pretty shocking to claim that he has small Latin or less Greek. Although Stratfordians like to trot this argument out because it seems to indicate that Shakespeare would have been less educated than a typical nobleman. However, if you actually read the longer poem, Ben Jonson is clearly not saying this at all. Jonson is talking about how Shakespeare is on par with the greatest ancient writers, like Sophocles and Euripides, that he is in fact a writer for the ages. Though also meant even if. So Jonson is saying, "And even if thou hadst small Latin and less Greek, from thence to honor thee I would not seek for names, but call forth thundering Aeschylus, Euripides, and Sophocles to us." So he's saying that even if Shakespeare wasn't proficient in Greek and Latin, he would still see fit to compare him to the Greek and Roman greats. This question of small Latin and less Greek gets additionally confusing because Stratfordians will simultaneously claim that Will must have learned Latin and Greek at the grammar school in Stratford-upon-Avon, where there's no evidence that he attended. So they're simultaneously saying that he learned these languages and that he didn't. Argument 6. Questioning who wrote Shakespeare is classist. When you demonstrate your competence at debunking Stratfordian arguments, you will likely be faced with the ultimate weapon in the Stratfordian arsenal, an ad hominem accusation that you are motivated by class snobbery. You can point out that famous Stratford skeptics include socialist sympathizer Helen Keller, radical Malcolm X, and American folk heroes Mark Twain and Walt Whitman, all of whom were clearly led by their curiosity rather than a classist agenda. Or you can offer this thought experiment. If Will Shakespeare had risen up from an illiterate household to become the greatest playwright of all time, wouldn't he be ensured that his children knew how to read and write rather than allowing them to grow up as illiterate as he had? Now you're ready to debate a Stratfordian. Like and subscribe for more facts about Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, and to learn more about the Oxfordian case for Shakespeare authorship.